Hello everyone, in this session we'll be learning about the external features of the cerebral hemisphere. So here there is a 3D model in which we'll be learning. So what all topics we'll be covering? We'll be covering the various borders and surfaces of the cerebral hemisphere, the different poles of the cerebral hemisphere, then various sulci and gyri in relation with the various surfaces. Okay, so stay tuned till the end of this particular session. So let's begin with the surfaces and the borders of the cerebral hemisphere. So when we see the cerebral hemisphere from the top, there are two cerebral hemispheres which are divided by a median longitudinal fissure. Okay, so to understand the surface and borders, one-sided cerebral hemisphere will take to understand it in a much better way. So this is a specimen of one-sided cerebral hemisphere. The left-sided cerebral hemisphere is seen. So if we see the surfaces towards the midline, here this on the medial aspect, this surface is referred to as the medial surface. On the outer aspect, this surface is referred to as the superolateral surface. Then on the inferior aspect, that's the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so these surfaces are divided by borders. So which are those borders? Let's see. The superolateral surface is divided by medial surface with a border that is referred to as the superomedial border. Similarly, on the inferior aspect, there are two borders. Let's see the inferior aspect. So on the inferior aspect, there is inferomedial border and inferolateral border. But on the inferior aspect, there are subdivisions. We'll see what are those subdivisions. On the inferomedial aspect, there is a part which is referred to as medial orbital border. Then there is a part which is referred to as hippocampal border. And there is one more part behind that is referred to as medial occipital border. Okay. And on the lateral aspect, anteriorly there is a border that is referred to as superciliary border, and behind this border is referred to as inferolateral border proper. Okay, inferolateral. So inferolateral border, the two subdivisions are superciliary border and the inferolateral border proper. Okay, and on the medial aspect, inferomedial border has got three subdivisions. Okay, and inferior surface of the brain also has got subdivisions. This surface is referred to as the orbital surface. Okay, orbital surface, and behind on the inferior surface of the temporal lobe, the surface is referred to as tentorial surface. Okay, so on the inferior aspect, borders also show subdivision, surface also shows subdivision. Okay. Then let's look at the different poles of the cerebral hemisphere. On the anterior aspect, the pole is referred to as the frontal pole. Okay, this one is the frontal pole. Then temporal lobe anteriorly, the pole is referred to as temporal pole. And behind in the occipital lobe, the pole is referred to as occipital pole of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so there are three poles: frontal, temporal and occipital. Okay, now let's look at how the cerebral hemisphere is divided into different lobes. So lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. So for that, important sulci that we need to identify is the central sulcus. Okay, so this sulcus that we can see here, that's the central sulcus. Okay, when we trace this sulcus towards the superomedial border, it will cut the superomedial border, and its approximate location, if we have to see, this is the frontal pole, this is the occipital pole. Okay, approximately at the midpoint of the frontal pole and occipital pole, and 1 centimeter behind it. Okay, 1 centimeter behind the midpoint of frontal pole and occipital pole is the location of central sulcus. Okay, and in front of it, the lobe is referred to as frontal lobe, and there is one prominent sulcus seen on the lateral aspect. This sulcus is referred to as lateral sulcus. Okay, lateral sulcus also referred to as Sylvian sulcus, And central sulcus is also referred to as central sulcus of Rolando. Okay, and the lobe here is referred to as temporal lobe. Okay, and behind there is a lobe called as occipital lobe. So there is no clear-cut demarcation that is seen on the superolateral surface. So for that we have to draw an imaginary line. Okay, so how to draw the imaginary lines? So parieto-occipital sulcus, if we see, it is more clear on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, this one is the medial surface. On the medial surface, the prominent sulcus is seen. That's the parieto-occipital sulcus. Okay, this one is parieto-occipital sulcus. Okay, some part of parieto-occipital sulcus extends on the superolateral surface. Let's see that. So parieto-occipital sulcus, some part is extending here. Okay, so from there we have to draw one imaginary line to a point called as pre-occipital notch. 3 centimeters in front of the occipital pole there is a depression that called as pre-occipital notch. Okay, so from the region where the parieto-occipital sulcus is extending up to the pre-occipital notch, an imaginary line has to be drawn. Okay, and we know the lateral sulcus here. Draw an imaginary line extending from the lateral sulcus to this imaginary line. Okay, that's how we can divide this area into different lobes. Okay, here is the parietal lobe, then behind is the occipital lobe, and here is the temporal lobe. Okay, so parietal, temporal and occipital are divided by these two imaginary lines. Okay, so by this we can divide the different lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so now once we have divided the lobes, now we should learn about the various sulci and gyri in each lobes and in relation with the various surfaces. Okay, so first let's start with the superolateral surface. So two important sulci we have already covered. One is the central sulcus and other is the lateral sulcus. So central sulcus, once we have identified, there is a gyrus in front of it. That gyrus is referred to as precentral gyrus. Okay, so again try to identify the central sulcus. Where is it? Yes, this one is the central sulcus. The gyrus in front of it is precentral gyrus. The gyrus behind it is referred to as postcentral gyrus. Okay, and there is a sulcus in front of the gyrus as well. That is referred to as precentral sulcus. This sulcus is referred to as postcentral sulcus. Okay, so in relation with the central sulcus, adjacent sulci gyri we can identify. Then coming to the anterior aspect of the frontal lobe. On the anterior aspect of the frontal lobe, 3 gyri are seen separated by 2 sulci. Let's identify that. There is one sulcus that is referred to as superior frontal sulcus. There is one sulcus that is referred to as inferior frontal sulcus. Okay, an area above and below it there are gyrus. There is superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, then inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, so 2 sulci and 3 gyri in relation to it, superior, middle and the inferior frontal gyrus. In the inferior frontal gyrus there are subdivisions that are seen. The lateral sulcus, we know it has got a posterior ramus, then it has got an ascending ramus, then it has got anterior horizontal ramus. Okay, so there are areas in relation to it. So anterior area is referred to as pars orbitalis, and there is a triangular area called as pars triangularis, and behind it there is an area called as pars opercularis. Okay, pars opercularis is the area which is having the Broca's motor speech area. Okay, so that's why these 3 subdivisions are important. So this was about the frontal lobe. So just like in frontal lobe has got 3 gyrus, similarly the temporal lobe also has got 3 gyrus separated by 2 sulcus. Let's see that. So here we can see the temporal lobe. So let's identify the sulci and gyri. This gyrus, this sulcus is referred to as superior temporal sulcus. This sulcus is referred to as inferior temporal sulcus. The gyrus above and below it, this is the superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, and inferior temporal gyrus. Okay, so similar to that of the frontal lobe, temporal lobe has got 2 sulci and 3 gyri. Okay, now let's look at the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe, one gyrus we have already identified, that was the post central gyrus, and one prominent sulcus is seen here, that is referred to as intraparietal sulcus. Okay, this prominent sulcus is referred to as intraparietal sulcus, and above it there is a gyrus that is referred to as superior parietal lobule. Below it there is inferior parietal lobule. Okay, in the region of inferior parietal lobule there are 2 important additional gyrus. If we see this lateral sulcus extending up, there is a gyrus called as supramarginal gyrus, and superior temporal sulcus, when we trace behind, there is a gyrus above it that is called as angular gyrus. Okay, these areas are related with Wernicke's speech area. Okay, these are important areas. Wernicke's speech area is related with supramarginal and angular gyrus, and we saw one area, pars opercularis, related with the Broca's motor speech area. Okay, so this was parietal lobe. Then in occipital lobe, one important sulcus from the medial surface, it continues. Medial surface we saw one sulcus, that was the parieto-occipital sulcus, behind which there is a sulcus called as calcarine sulcus, some part of which extends on the superolateral surface near the occipital pole. That part is referred to as the post-calcarine part of the calcarine sulcus. Okay, so let's see that. We can see this part extending here, that's the post-calcarine part of calcarine sulcus, and there is a sulcus covering it as a margin. This sulcus is referred to as lunate sulcus. Okay, I'll just mark it. So this one is the lunate sulcus, and this sulcus is the post-calcarine part of the calcarine sulcus. Okay, one more sulcus seen here on the occipital lobe, that's referred to as the lateral occipital sulcus. Okay, so these are the important sulci gyri on the superolateral surface. Now let's look at the medial surface. So on the medial surface, first you should identify the corpus callosum. This one is the corpus callosum. The different parts of the corpus callosum are important. The part here, that's referred to as the rostrum of the corpus callosum, and the part here is referred to as the genu of the corpus callosum. This is referred to as the body of the corpus callosum, and this is referred to as the splenium of corpus callosum. Okay, different parts are important because you have to identify which part of the cerebral hemisphere is anterior and posterior. For that we look for the distance from the genu to the frontal pole. Okay, this distance is around 4 centimeters, and from the splenium to the occipital pole, this distance is around 6 centimeters. Okay, in this specimen, cerebellum and the brainstem is there, so it is easy to differentiate which is anterior and posterior, but at times this part may not be there in the brain specimen. So the distance between genu and distance between splenium and the respective poles, okay, frontal pole, occipital pole, it helps to determine which part of the cerebral hemisphere is anterior and posterior. Okay, once we have identified it, and then we'll be able to further identify different sulci and gyri. Just above the corpus callosum, the sulcus is referred to as callosal sulcus. Above it, the gyrus is referred to as cingulate gyrus, and just above it there is a sulcus called as cingulate sulcus. Okay, so go in one order: corpus callosum, above it is callosal sulcus, then cingulate gyrus, above it is the cingulate sulcus. Okay, trace the cingulate sulcus behind, and there is an area in front of it. This area is referred to as paracentral lobule. Okay, this is paracentral lobule. Okay, And then come on the posterior aspect. This sulcus here, we have identified it as the parieto-occipital sulcus. This sulcus here, that's the calcarine sulcus. Okay, there is a triangular area in between them. This area is referred to as cuneus. Then area in front of this triangular area, that's referred to as precuneus. Okay, then between the calcarine sulcus and the splenium, there is an area here that's referred to as the isthmus. Okay, isthmus. And above the splenium there is a sulcus seen, that's referred to as the suprasplenial sulcus. Okay, so these are the various sulci gyri which are seen on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Additional what all structures are seen on the medial surface, that also try to identify. This is the septum pellucidum, and just below septum pellucidum there is a structure that is referred to as fornix. Okay, it's a white matter bundle, fornix, and this is the region of thalamus. Okay, thalamus, and below it is the hypothalamus. In between them there is a sulcus that is referred to as hypothalamic sulcus. Okay, I'll just mark the hypothalamic sulcus. This is the region of hypothalamic sulcus extending from the commencement of cerebral aqueduct to the foramen of Monro. Okay, this one opening is seen just below the fornix. This is the foramen of Monro. Okay, from the foramen of Monro up to the commencement of cerebral aqueduct, there is an S-shaped hypothalamic sulcus dividing this area into the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Okay, we can see a small area that is interthalamic adhesion that is seen here. Okay, and the different parts of the brainstem are seen: midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. This one is the cerebellum. Okay, and this cavity here, that's the fourth ventricle. Okay, that cavity is the fourth ventricle, and the cavity between the two thalamus and hypothalamus in this region, that's the third ventricle. Okay, and on the inner aspect of the septum pellucidum there will be one ventricle, that will be the lateral ventricle. Okay, so two lateral ventricles open into the third ventricle. From the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, it's by a duct called as aqueduct of Sylvius that passes through the midbrain, and here is the fourth ventricle. So there is the different parts of the ventricular system of the brain that we can appreciate on the medial surface. Now let's look at the inferior surface of the cerebrum for different sulci and gyri. Let's look at the whole brain specimen for it. So this is the whole brain specimen. Let's look at the inferior aspect. So on the inferior aspect, on the midline, this is referred to as the median longitudinal fissure between the two cerebral hemispheres. The gyrus just adjacent to it is referred to as gyrus rectus. Okay, gyrus just adjacent to it is referred to as gyrus rectus. Sulcus lateral to it is referred to as olfactory sulcus. Okay, olfactory sulcus, which lodges the olfactory tract. Okay, this is the olfactory tract. Anteriorly there will be one bulged part called as the olfactory bulb. Okay, then lateral to it, this surface everyone knows that this is the orbital surface. So there is a sulcus adjacent to it in the form of a H-shaped letter, that's referred to as orbital sulcus, and the gyrus in relation to it are referred to as anterior orbital gyrus, posterior orbital gyrus, lateral orbital gyrus, medial orbital gyrus. Okay, and this is the orbital surface. It is having the orbital sulcus and the orbital gyri. Okay, then coming on the posterior aspect, in the tentorial surface there are three gyri separated by two sulci. Okay, so three gyri separated by two sulci we had seen in the frontal lobe, we had seen in the temporal lobe. Now here on the inferior surface also similar thing is there. The lateral most gyrus that we can see here, that is the lateral occipitotemporal gyrus. Okay, lateral occipitotemporal gyrus. This one is referred to as the medial occipitotemporal gyrus, and the medial most is referred to as the parahippocampal gyrus. Okay, that's the parahippocampal gyrus. Okay, and the sulci in between them, the lateral one is having the same name as that of this gyrus, called as occipitotemporal sulcus. Okay, occipitotemporal sulcus, and the medial one there is a different name. The name is referred to as collateral sulcus. Okay, medial one is collateral sulcus and the lateral one is occipitotemporal sulcus. The gyrus in relation to them are lateral occipitotemporal gyrus, medial occipitotemporal gyrus. The medial most is this parahippocampal gyrus. Parahippocampal gyrus, when we trace on the anterior aspect, there is a slight bend which is seen, a hook-like bend on the anterior aspect that is referred to as uncus. Okay, trace the parahippocampal gyrus anteriorly. This part is referred to as uncus. Okay, so these are the various sulci gyri that are seen on the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so we had covered different surfaces, borders of the cerebral hemisphere, the different poles of the cerebral hemisphere, the different lobes of the cerebral hemisphere, how they are divided, then the sulci and gyri in relation with each surface, and also functional areas in relation with the sulci and gyri are important. I'll add that in the PDF handout that I share with you all. Okay, so for PDF handout of this particular session, you all can WhatsApp me at this number, and please do watch other sessions of this YouTube channel and stay tuned, more content is coming soon. Okay, thank you.